The following table gives us some categories of the U.S. federal budget spending for 2019. So we have the spending in billions of dollars. So the Defense Department spent $676 billion. And Social Security, that's kind of the more awkward one, it says $1,038 billion. So think about what number that would be. That one would be in the trillions place. So that'd be $1,038 billion. There are several ways that one can measure change between two values. We've already learned about one way, the average rate of change or slope. So in number one, let's suppose the defense spending was $580 billion in 2015. What is the average rate of change or slope in the defense spending from 2015 to 19? And so you get your answer, include your units. So we have, starting at $580 billion, that's the earlier year, and then in 2019 it had gone up to $676 billion. So this is just a straightforward rate of change or slope problem. And this is something that in this class you should be able to do. You can pause the video and I'll put the answer up if you wanted to work on it. Okay, you get change in Y, which is the change in billions of dollars, divided by the change in the years. So you get $24 billion per year, okay, which is just saying that the defense spending increased at a rate of $24 billion per year. So nothing too crazy there. What we're going to look at now are some different ways to measure change. One of them is absolute change, and the other is relative change. Absolute change tells us by how much two values differ. Relative change tells us the percentage change in a value. So if we look at that same example, we'll look at how to calculate each of those changes. So absolute change is the new value minus the old value, and relative change is that new minus old, but then you have to divide it by the old. And we'll get to what that means later on when we explain it. Okay, so same example. We started at $580 billion in 2015, and then we raised it to $676 billion. So the absolute change is just the new value minus the old value. And when we have years involved like this, from 2015 to 2019, it should be easy to figure out what the new value is and what the old value is. So when you do new value, that's the most recent value. So that's the 676, and then minus the 580, the old value, and that'll give you $96 billion. And again, there should be nothing overly crazy here. If you wanted to think about what does that mean, it just means that this first value, the new value, is $96 billion more than the old value. So defense spending increased by $96 billion from 2015 to 19. And notice I'm not saying per year or anything. We're just saying the total change was $96 billion over that time span. That's one way to say it. The other way to say it, you could say the defense spending was $96 billion more in 2019 than in 2015. And both of those should make sense. And again, hopefully it's not overwhelming on explaining that. Okay, that should be pretty straightforward. Okay, now we're going to look at relative change, which is new minus old, which we already have, 96 billion, divided by the old. And the old value, the first value, was 580 billion. So if we do that calculation, the relative change, we get 96 over 580, which is 0.1655. And this is where relative change is a little more thinking to it than the absolute change. In the description, I said relative change tells us the percentage change in a value. So this 0.1655 as a percent is 16.55%. So think about what that would mean. From where we started, from the 580, the 676 is 16.55% higher than that. or more than that. So the way you describe that, again, I'm going to show you two different ways to describe it. The defense spending increased by 16.55% over those 4 years. Or you could say the defense spending was 16.55% more in 2019 than in 2015. So hopefully that isn't too crazy to think about. Okay, going on to the next example. I'll have you try this, and then I'll put the answer up. It's the same idea, except I call it other discretionary. So you can find that in the table. It was $600 billion in 2015, and then $500 billion in 2019. So what you might notice there, before I tell you to try it, and try it on your own, notice that the spending went down. The other discretionary spending went down. $600 billion down to $500 billion. So think about when you get your answers, what that's going to, how that's going to show up in your answers. So you can pause the video and I'll put the answers up just to keep this moving along. Okay, so absolute change, new minus old, the newer value is 500 billion. The older value was 600 billion. Notice you get negative 100 billion. And that just means the OD, for other discretionary, spending was $100 billion less in 2019 than in 2015. So that negative tells you that the spending went down or was less. The average rate of change, again, find the slope. We ended at 500 billion, we started at 600 billion, so 500 minus 600 divided by the 4 years that went by is negative $25 billion per year. So that just means that the OD spending decreased by $25 billion per year. Okay, the negative is taken care of with the word decreased. Okay, and then the relative change. This is probably the trickiest one to figure out. But again, you take the new minus old divided by old. So 500 minus 600 divided by 600. So new minus old divided by old. A lot of people will look at relative change and they just in their head always want to do the larger minus the smaller value. You can't think that way here. What you want to think about new minus old divided by the old. That negative is significant. Just like with the slope, the negative means that the spending decreased. Well, with the relative change having a negative, it means you had a negative percentage. And when you do that calculation, you get negative 0.1667. If you make it a percentage, that's about negative 16.67%. The explanation for that is the percentage that the spending decreased by. So the OD spending was 16.67% less in 2019 than in 2015. Now you could also say the OD spending decreased by 16.67% in those 4 years. The next example we look at brings up a different case. Sometimes we can't classify one of the values as the new or the old value. We're going to use absolute and relative change to compare the 2019 defense spending to 2019 Social Security spending. And it's important to understand here is that now what we're looking at is just the comparison between two different categories in the same year. So we can't really say that one of them is a new value and one of them is an old value. Okay, so that's a little wrinkle on this absolute and relative change. Okay, so if we just subtract two values, so we take the Social Security, subtract the defense spending, you end up with $362 billion. If you did that backwards, 676 minus 1,038, You can do that. The only difference is that will be negative $362 billion. When you described that absolute change or absolute difference, you would say the Social Security spending is $362 billion more than the defense spending. You could also word it as the defense spending was $362 billion less than the Social Security spending. That would be if you did it backwards and got the negative $362 billion. Again, that shouldn't be too crazy. Notice that saying Social Security is the new and defense spending is the old. You can't really define them that way, but you can still apply the same principle to find absolute change. Just subtract the two values and then explain what they mean. Relative change. Okay, so think about with relative change, if we stay consistent here and do 1,038 minus 676, this is extremely essential to understand. When you find the relative change, what you divide by has to match up with that thing with the second number in your subtraction. So if you did 1,038 minus 676, you have to divide by 676. I'll explain the other way in a second if you did it backwards. So here you get 362 over 676. If you divide that, you get a decimal of 0.5355, which represents 53.55%. Okay, so explaining this is a little bit different now, or a little bit more difficult, because you're comparing two categories. So notice how we set up here. We got a positive $362 billion, which just meant that Social Security spending was that much more than defense spending. Same idea, we get a positive percentage, which just means the Social Security spending was this percent more than the defense spending. Okay, so the Social Security spending was 53.55% more than the defense spending. If you chose to do relative change the other way, meaning instead of doing the Social Security minus defense divided by defense, if you did defense minus Social Security, you have to divide by that second number, Social Security. And what that does, it gives you a negative 362 over 1,038, which is negative 34.87%. So if you want to explain that, that just meant that one was smaller than the other. Well, which one was less? Was it the Social Security or defense? The defense spending was 34.8% less than the Social Security spending. And what students have a hard time with is getting different percentages here. A lot of times they want to think that if one is 53.55, then if you did the opposite, you would get negative 53.55. That is not true because of the division. When you're dividing by 676, that's different than dividing by 1,038. So that's why it's really important to pay attention. When you divide, you have to make sure that what you divide by matches up with that second piece or second number in the subtraction every single time. Okay, so the last part, compare the 2019 spending for Medicare and defense using relative change and explain your answer. So go ahead and do that, and I'll pause it. Or you pause it. Okay, so the Medicare spending was 14.64% more than defense spending. And if you have trouble with which one you put first and how do you explain less or more is going to be because of the positive percentage. And then just think about which one was higher, which one was more. The Medicare was higher than defense. So Medicare spending was more than defense. And then just substitute in your percentage into that wording. Okay, the very last thing to look at here, okay, and we'll kind of go through this fairly quickly, is that sometimes with a word problem, sometimes your values are given as percentages. And that makes our descriptions more awkward. So number 4, if you read number 4, You can pause it and read it, but I'm going to go on. Essentially saying the unemployment rate went from 7% down to 4.5% 4 years later. So to describe the unemployment change, in those 4 years, the unemployment rate decreased by 2.5 percentage points. That is finding absolute change. So just subtracting 4.5 minus 7 is a difference of 2.5 percentage points. Believe it or not, saying that word points in there is extremely important. It didn't decrease by 2.5%. It decreased by 2.5 percentage points. You went from 4.5%, you went from 7% down to 4.5%, which is 2.5 percentage points. Okay, so that's absolute change when your variables are in percentages like this. Okay, using the relative change from January 14 to 2018, find the relative change, so subtract the percentages, so new minus old, divided by old, and you get negative 35.7%, which means the unemployment rate decreased by 35.7%. I violated my ruler. I said round to the nearest percent, so that should really be 36%. Okay, I didn't round correctly in my answer key. Okay, and then the last one, we're finding average rate of change because it's saying percentage points per year. So here, if you find the average rate of change, 4.5 minus 7 divided by the change in time gives you negative 0.625. So the unemployment rate decreased by 0.625 percentage points per year. Okay, so taking that example, apply it to number 5, and we are getting very long in the video, so I'm just going to tell you to pause the video, and then I'm going to show the answers, and I'm not going to explain too much on them. Okay, so absolute change, final minus original, is 16 percentage points. Relative change, this one's a little bit different because notice what happens when you do this division, you get 1.33. Well, if you just got 0.33, that'd be 33%, wouldn't it? So that 1 means 100%. So the percent who support increased by 133%. Okay, or you could say 133% more than on January 10th. And then the average rate of change, well, here you take the difference divided by the 6 weeks that went by, and you get 2.67% per week. So the percentage who support increased by 2.67 percentage points per week. Okay, so that's just another wrinkle in some of these word problems if you're given percentages to start with.